lots of people have been involved in the modelling and the models that I'll be referring to. The one person who's not been involved in the model development at all is me. So I was sort of asked to really talk about the benefits of coupling models rather than keeping them standalone. The sort of process that we've gone through to try and couple models within an integrated modelling platform. And then, because in these sort of coupled systems, error or uncertainty propagation is always something that comes up time and time again, how we've sort of tried to explore that uncertainty within these systems. I love this photograph. It's my favourite front cover photograph. It's from a DEFRA report, and I can't remember which one it is now, but for me it really sort of helps remind me about the real complexity of the systems that we are trying to model, but also the spatial interrelationships that we need to be modeling and some of the interactions. And I will be coming back to this later if I have the time and don't speak too slowly. So already in the past 2 days we've heard about some absolutely fantastic detailed, complex models of different parts of the broad landscape system. So Callum's been telling us about his crafty model for rural land use. Justin and others have talked about hydrological models. Mark talked about urban development models. So we've got these great models that are simulating components of the system, but pretty much in isolation. They're not interacting with the other parts of this landscape system. So we tend to have these fantastic, detailed, complex models where we put in inputs, we see a change, and then maybe we interpret those changes in the light of results from some other models. But there's no interaction. And yet we know in reality, and it's come up a lot so far, how important those systemic interactions is. So one particular integrated or coupled modelling platform that I've been involved in developing is the Impressions Integrated Assessment Platform 2, which came from the imaginatively titled, you can probably guess, Integrated Assessment Platform 1, in which a whole series of model emulators or meta models of those more complex models were developed and then linked. So the rug model that Mark mentioned, an emulator of that is up here. The model, one of the models that Callum referred to, but not by name, is down here. And these emulators are taking in data and physical data, climate data, socioeconomic data, and the models are passing information through that system from model to model. And hopefully, if the conceptualization of that is a realistic representation of the way that these systems operate, then we get interactions and competitions between resources that are somewhat realistic. So for example, the representation of a competition for water, between water for drinking, water for agriculture, water for the ecology, or competition for land, between land for housing, land for trees, land for farming, land for non-agricultural habitats. And so we get that sort of more systemic representation with those models interacting and influencing and constraining downstream models. So one of the things that was done a few years ago on the ClimSave IAP1 platform was to compare what were the benefits, and I'll put benefits in inverted commas, of running these emulators in a linked systemic framework as opposed to running the emulators as standalone models. And what we've got here is a whole series of indicators that were coming out of the platform from urbanisation, forestry, grassland, irrigation, carbon storage, water stress, food provisioning. And the colours just simply reflect the percentage of the outputs of the models, so the gridded outputs, in which the values of the standalone version of the emulator were the same as the values from the integrated emulators, where outputs were being passed to downstream models. So, for example, the urban model is right at the top of the modelling chain because there's a presumption that urbanisation has the first call on land. So the urban model, the 100% of the outputs from the standalone version were the same as in the integrated version because there was no model data passing to it. But as you move down the modelling system, which in essence is sort of moving up here, the proportion of the results that are identical is decreasing. And it particularly becomes apparent when we have not just climate change but socio-economic change in there, because more and more components of that system, whether it be the demand of land for housing, for drinking water, changing societal values, changing technology, are feeding through that modelling system. So the integrated models definitely give different outputs, and we would hope, given the conceptualization that underpins the linking of those models, that it's a more realistic representation. And those differences between the standalone and integrated versions of the models also differ in space. So these aren't uniform differences. This is reflecting some of the emergent behaviours that are coming up through that integration of the models. So one of the challenges in doing this was obviously each of those detailed models and their emulators of them were being developed by different modelling groups with different perspectives, different languages. So we had to go through a process of really trying to define the data dictionaries for these models, what was coming in, what was going out, and then standardising those across each of the each of the data transfers, so that what we termed a running module, but I suspect Gordon would be referring to as middleware, was passing the right information to the right model, and the model was getting what it expected to get. Now, unsurprisingly here, one of the secrets of getting this to work is lots of communication. Because not most modelers, some modelers in my experience aren't tremendously good at unambiguously explaining their own model to somebody from a different discipline. Unbelievable, I know. So communication to break down those disciplinary divides and those disciplinary languages was really important and was not a short process. So as I mentioned before, when you're bringing these in a sense independently developed emulators together, so one group has developed that and they're passing their data to a different group who's developed that. There is always the concern about uncertainty propagation through that modelling chain. You know, whatever's happening with that model, or the uncertainty in that model is affecting that, which is affecting that. So at the end of it, are your outputs essentially a reflection of that uncertainty magnifying through the model or not? And that was something that through all of these projects, through ClimSave and Impressions, quite a lot of effort went into exploring that, using a range of quantitative and sort of qualitative methods that I'll just sort of briefly explore. So one of the things that we did were structured sensitivity analyses or impact response surfaces, where in this case we're changing the y-axis is changes in precipitation against changes in temperature. And we have a range of different indicators related to agriculture, hydrology, biodiversity and forestry, and the response surfaces for different parts of Europe. And what you're getting there is, or what it's showing, is some of the non-linearities in the model response, some of the tipping points that were alluded to yesterday, but also some of the emergent behaviour that is coming through these integrated models. So they're not some of those changes are quite challenging to interpret and quite challenging to explain because of the data transfers that are working through and the competition that is happening within the model. But structured sensitivity analyses like these have been very useful as a way of testing the behaviour of these models to relatively simple changes. A slightly more complex method that was done was looking at uncertainty propagation from the scenarios. So these integrated platforms that I've been talking about were developed to be interactive participatory tools. They were designed to be used by a broad church of stakeholders, scientists or whatever. So within the scenarios, each socioeconomic input, in this case it's change in dietary preference for white meat, has for its scenario a default value, a sort of, the green is a credible uncertainty space, a more likely uncertainty space, and the yellow is the more extreme uncertainty of that parameter within the scenario narrative. And using that range of uncertainty, they were converted into density plots, and the 21 socioeconomic inputs for each scenario were sampled and put through the system. And the idea was to explore whether that socioeconomic uncertainty within the four scenarios would essentially go bleh, and you would get a very wide, flat distribution of outputs that essentially the uncertainty was just expanding through the modelling cascade, or as actually turned out, you got relatively constrained uncertainty distributions in the outputs, in this case food production per capita. So it was a way of evaluating, to some extent, again, the uncertainty propagation. A different way of quantifying the uncertainty propagation was this beautiful diagram that is so self-explanatory I thought I might skip it. But essentially the person you want to ask is over there, Rob Dunford. But this was an uncertainty analysis of this linked modelling system based on talking to the modellers about their view of the uncertainty of the outputs from their model, and then the propagation of those uncertainties through the system to eventual other output variables. So this is not a quantitative analysis. This was capturing the modeller's views about their own models, because as Callum said, some of these things are quite hard to validate, some of these models. So it's about capturing their belief and trust in their models and seeing how that then goes through the variable to variable network of the model. How long have I got? I started late, didn't I? 3 minutes. Excellent, that's perfect. as I say, I love this photograph. I love it because my background is partly in soils. I'm one of the people that, when you had the pleasure of going around areas mapping soils. And this is, to me, is fantastic because you can see how soils are influencing a landscape. So we've got relatively freely drained soils down here. We've got groundwater dominated soils here. We can see the rushes. We've got low permeability soils down here. We've got shallow soils restricting use. It's influenced strongly by soils. And many of you will have used the National Soil Map. But all soil maps essentially are statistical. They do not tell you what is there. They tell you what is likely to be there in a certain proportion. And 571T, and this goes for any scale of map, whether it's 25,000 scale map or 250,000, they're all the same. They always tell you essentially a percentage coverage of what is in that polygon. 571T is effort to association. I don't care that you won't know what effort is. It's a typical argillic brown earth. But what's important is it's a permeable soil, it is a free draining soil, and it is light textured. And on average, it occupies 31% of the polygon. 31%. The rest of it is occupied by Hornbeam, Wickham, Southminster and other soils. Hornbeam is a slowly permeable soil that suffers waterlogging due to that low permeability. It's got a slightly heavier topsoil. Wickham is very slowly permeable. It's almost an impermeable soil that has extensive multi-season waterlogging if you haven't got land drainage in. And Southminster is a permeable soil that has seasonal waterlogging due to groundwater. Those are four fundamentally different soils with different management constraints, different hydrology. Now, in my experience of working with modelers, I love how they use soil data. So I've worked with modelers that say, well, actually, none of this matters. It's just the top layer. That's all that matters. Topsoil texture is all you need. I've worked with modelers who had said, well, all soils are free draining. Okay? That all causes of waterlogging are the same. Doesn't matter whether it's due to impermeability or shallow groundwater. But there's only one soil, we can ignore all these. Or my favourite one is the sort of unicorn soil. Take a horse and a cow, average them, you get a unicorn, one horn. We all do that. And I mentioned very quickly about modelers. Modelers make assumptions. We know that, you know that. Those assumptions are not necessarily in the model or part of the model. They are the modeler's conceptualization. So in this system, unlike Callum's model, food demand must be satisfied. That is not a requirement of the model. That is the conceptualization of the modeler. And the behaviour of this system compared to Callum's is because the modeler has made a decision. And we often forget, I think, in a lot of these assessments around uncertainty, what the modeler has actually produced. So when we look at these uncertainty cascades, I think we're really good at lots of them. But I think, as already been said, we're not very good at sampling a range of models, and the model structures within those range of models, which are a consequence of modelers' choices, I think are often underrepresented. And I shall stop there, and that's just under time. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ian. Actually, I'm going to say, can you keep your questions till the discussion at the end? We will go straight into the discussion after the